Hey guys, I guess this week we're actually discussing our final papers and what we're researching on. And my final paper topic was on the Franco-American Alliance of 1778. Throughout my schooling, we always talk about Lexington and Concord, Battle of Bunker Hill. Uh, we also discuss Yorktown, and it always seems like all of a sudden the French were there, the French Navy and the Army. And of course, they never really go into detail about the actual alliance. Well, the alliance, the origins obviously took place right after the Battle of Concord. Uh, the American forces discovered, well, you know what, we really don't have a lot of gunpowder, we don't have a lot of supplies. The Americans, quite frankly, were not prepared. They just didn't have everything that they needed, and therefore they needed to find some kind of partner or some ally that will actually help them out, particularly in supplies of gunpowder, um, actual bullets, rifles, cannons, you name it, they needed it. So the origins were around that time, and it wasn't until around 1776 Congress decided to send people over to maybe discuss with the French. However, the French weren't really interested in helping us at first because, while they weren't really sure what's going on, would we actually turn back to the British? We fight. It's like, oh, let's make peace. Let's call a truce, and maybe what will happen is we would actually get to represent ourselves in the colonies and would send money over. Maybe something to that effect. And so the French weren't really interested in that. And this is what I found interesting about the Declaration of Independence. It wasn't really targeted to King George III, nor was it really for us to stir us up, to say, hey, yeah, that sounds great. We need independence. No, the actual target audience was the French king. And it was really to help assure them that we are for independence. We don't want to be under the British orbit anymore. We want to be free and independent. And after that, that's when the French actually started getting serious about maybe negotiating an alliance. They certainly helped us with arms and other supplies around this time. And in fact, it was merchants that actually helped us with that. And the French were still kind of leery about maybe forming an alliance. They weren't really sure about how our army was operating because after 1776, especially right after the victories at Princeton and Trenton, the army was kind of actually getting defeated time after time. It wasn't until the Battle of Saratoga where we actually did win. That kind of helped influence the French, but it was also the Battle of Germantown, which you wouldn't think so because it was a defeat. Washington was actually defeated by the British, but apparently the army actually performed fairly well. Even though it was a defeat, they retreated in order, so the army remained intact, and that actually helped the French decide, you know what? Yep, we're going to sign a treaty. We're going to negotiate, and the negotiations really it wasn't until after 1777 that negotiations were really uh, going full steam ahead. In fact, it was basically the treaty was negotiated within 3 weeks in January of 1778, and it was signed on February 6, 1778. But again, the alliance didn't really work out as smoothly as you would expect. I mean, there were some missed opportunities and there were some misunderstandings. The French did send a fleet in 1778, somewhere around there, and Washington and the admiral that was in command of the fleet decided, you know what? Yes, let's do a joint operation. Let's take over Newport, Rhode Island. Fairly small city, had an excellent port, and I believe it was lightly defended. So if the attack was fully coordinated, there shouldn't been any reason why it shouldn't have been taken. However, the operation ended in failure. There was a storm, and it damaged some of the French ships, and the admiral commanding it decided, well, you know what, my ships are damaged, I need to get them repaired. However, the general in command of the Continental Army that was, on the land side said, no, wait, you need to help us out because we're trying to take this place. But the French pulled up anchor and they withdrew to Boston. And John Sullivan, who happens to be the commanding officer of the Continental Army, charged the admiral with cowardice, which kind of ruffled some feathers, and it was up to George Washington to actually smooth things over. And he managed to do that. And there was another obstacle, and that was John Adams. He wrote a number of letters to the foreign minister of France saying, you know what, you really need to send another fleet. We need to have naval supremacy. Once we have naval supremacy in American waters, it's almost guaranteed we will defeat the British. However, the French foreign minister kind of balked at that notion, and he actually was kind of insulted by Adams because Adams, he was kind of a rough kind of guy, I guess if you want to call it that. He wasn't very tactful, and so he upset the French foreign minister. And there might have been a point where what, this alliance ain't worth it. Get out. But lucky enough that didn't occur. Benjamin Franklin kind of smoothed things out, and Adams, well, he decided he had enough of France and he left for Holland and he negotiated a treaty of commerce there. Uh, However, guess what? Adams was correct. Once the French decided to send another fleet over, and I believe an army came over a year before in 1780. But once the French decided to send a fleet in 1781, they did manage to gain naval supremacy in American waters, and we managed to defeat the British at Yorktown. They were forced to surrender because they were completely surrounded. So Adams was vindicated. He was correct. And quite frankly, if we actually did what Adams suggested, the war probably could have ended like a year earlier. And part of my paper, I discussed whether or not uh, we would be able to win without the alliance. And I came to the conclusion, well, yes, we could have. It probably would have been rough going, like in 1776, 1777. We probably would be defeated over and over again. Uh, but if we actually changed our tactics rather than actually having line infantry, like George Washington, he wanted to fight the war based on the European methods. But if we actually changed our tactics and turned it into a more of a guerrilla warfare, I think we would have won. I mean, it would have took longer. I mean, after all, if we looked at the area of American history that I'm particularly interested in, which is the Vietnam War, if we actually looked at the war in Vietnam, uh, the Vietnamese or the North Vietnamese, they weren't victorious until like 20 years. It took them that long, maybe even longer, maybe 30 years actually. I think it's 30 years, considering they declared independence in 1945. They had a war with the French, and the country was divided after that, and then they fought us, and they didn't finally gain reunification until 1975. So it was about 30 years before they finally had, their independence, if you want to call it that. And it might have taken that long for us as well. Basically, this kind of warfare is war of wills. Whoever can outlast the other person. That's what would happen if we actually fought the war that way. Uh, that's pretty much all I have. And thank you for listening, and good luck on your papers as well.